Okay, as I said last week, I said we were going to go to another appendix, and I decided we covered that material pretty well already. And so I'm going to go to a different appendix. And I added at the bottom of this page, I added the paragraph, as you can see here. And I'll highlight the paragraph. I added this paragraph in the book. So I sent you a new copy of the book. I thought it would be well to just take the time and add it in. By the principle of exclusion, the law of exclusion can also be established by induction. Since the scriptures contain the universal information, all that we need to know to please God on any spiritual topic, and then we can draw a conclusion from it, a universal proposition, an A-type proposition from it. From that A-type proposition, we can convert it into an only-type exclusive proposition. And any question about that? I want you to notice how both English grammarians and logicians, Hurley, Copy, and so forth, use the words exclusive and exclusively in this chapter. Go back to the beginning chapter and just notice how many times those words are used. So this principle of exclusion is inherent in the word only. It excludes. Right? It's O applies what I call the law of exclusion to Nadab and Abihu. So it applies it to them. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go to Nadab and Abihu. We're going to go to page 457. All right, 447. That's Appendix O. And we'll look at Nadab and Abihu, and probably that's all we'll get covered tonight. We may go back, but I think that'll probably do us, probably take our time up. Nadab and Abihu were the sons of Aaron, and I want to go ahead and read the text of Leviticus 10, verses 1 and 2. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took each of them his censer and put fire therein and laid incense thereon and offered strange fire before Jehovah, which he had not commanded them. And there came forth fire from before Jehovah and devoured them, and they died before the Lord, or died before Jehovah. So they died because he had not commanded it of them. So this fits in with the principle of exclusion. We're going to show how it fits in as we develop this. This is also given again in Numbers 3 and verse 4 and Numbers 26:61. And Nadab and Abihu died before Jehovah when they offered strange fire before Jehovah in the wilderness of Sinai. They had no children. Eleazar and Ithamar ministered in the priest office in the presence of Aaron, their father. And in chapter 26, verse 61 of Numbers, and Nadab and Abihu died when they offered strange fire before Jehovah. So they offered strange fire and they died for it. It's apparent to me that they sinned because God killed them. And their sin was in doing something he had not commanded them to do for worship. That's pretty significant. And we'll lay out logically how this fits. God commanded and does commanded and commands in two different ways. First, by explicit statements, both specific and generic. And second, by implicit statements, both specific and generic. The following outline sets forth those four options. So we'll have to go to the next page. We have explicit statements and implicit statements. And explicit statements can be specific. We go back to chapter 13 that we just came from, or generic. And that's in chapter 13. Implicit could be implicit, and they could be either specific or generic. Back to chapter 13 again, which we'll go back to as soon as we finish this appendix. Nadab and Abihu violated God's law. The presence of sin by Nadab and Abihu proves they had a law regarding the fire. I can prove that from Romans 4:15 and Romans 5:13. Those are on our screen right now. The fact that God killed them proves that they sinned or they transgressed. That's my evidence that they sinned or transgressed God's law. Romans 4:15 says, "For the law worketh wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there transgression." If you don't have a law, you can't transgress it. So they had a law. That proves it. So we'll logically show this in just a minute. We also go to Romans 5:13, "For until the law of sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed, is not reckoned," King James reads, "where there is no law, it's not counted, not written to your account. There's no law." Now, we derive two premises from this. If there is no law, Romans 4:15, then there is no transgression. Second premise, Romans 5:13, "If there is no law, then sin is not imputed, not reckoned, not accounted, held to your account." If we apply contraposition to each of these premises, from contraposition, the first premise becomes, if there is transgression. Notice, remember, we negate both of them. Let's go back to our form up here and go back to this again, be sure we got it straight. So we take the first part, the antecedent, and the consequent, we reverse them and negate both of them. So if there's no law, we negate it, we put it at the last. And if there is no transgression, we negate it, and double negative becomes a positive, right? Remember that. So our premise becomes, by contraposition, if there is transgression, then there's a law. That's pretty plain. That we derive from it. If there's a transgression, there's got to be a law. The second one, by contraposition or transposition, becomes, if sin is imputed, then there's a law. If it's held to their account. And for crying out loud, their sin was held to their account because God killed them. So we know that it was imputed to them because they sinned and they were killed. So sin was imputed, they had to have a law. So by two arguments now, we've proven they had a law. Right? Any questions? Anybody? So we had the proof now that Nadab and Abihu had a law regarding the fire. Somehow they violated God's law. If one sins, my first premise, transgresses, then he has a law. And I gave both of these passages as evidence. One sinned, and then Nadab and Abihu sinned, therefore Nadab and Abihu had a law. Now, if Nadab and Abihu sinned regarding the fire, Leviticus 10, 1 through 3, then Nadab and Abihu had a law for the fire. Nadab and Abihu sinned regarding the fire, therefore they had a law. Are there questions? Stop me if you have a question. All right? The law that Nadab and Abihu violated was either a written law or it was an oral law. There's only two ways. Is it written or oral? God doesn't give it by feelings. He gives it by words. It's either written or oral. And he either spoke to him in dreams or visions or spoke to him directly as he did Moses. But we read in the text of the Bible that God said he wouldn't speak directly anymore. He only did that through Moses, wouldn't do it later to others. And of course, he did it to Jesus. I think he's talking about the people of that time. He spoke directly of Jesus to the apostles in the Transfiguration and at the baptism of Jesus as well. If Nadab and Abihu had a law for the fire, then the law was either written in the scriptures or God gave Nadab and Abihu oral instructions. Right? So they had a law, so it was either written or it was oral. Any questions? We're down to two options. If God killed Nadab and Abihu as an object lesson to other priests and recorded in the scriptures for other priests, then it is almost certain that he gave this law in written form. Otherwise, every other priest would have to be given oral instructions, but he's not going to treat them differently than he did Nadab and Abihu. It's possible that God had given oral instructions to them before Leviticus 10, verse 1, that it was written later in Leviticus 16, 1 and following. That's entirely possible. Or elsewhere, somewhere else. God punished people for sin and recorded it for other people's instructions or edification, and for our admonition, for our instruction. First Corinthians, that happened to them by way of example, and they're written for our admonition, verses 10 and verses 11, 1 Corinthians 10, 11, and 10, 13, both. Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire. We know that Nadab and Abihu sinned because God killed them. We know it was because they offered strange fire. If an act is sinful, here's what we derive from what the wording says. An act is sinful to do for worship, then the act is something God has not commanded for an act of worship. Right? So this tells me something here about God's commands. We're going to work on this by transposition and work through it, derive some simpler conclusions from it. An act is sinful to do for worship, right? If it's sinful, then it's something God has not commanded. The act is something that God has not commanded for an act of worship. So we're going to take strange fire for worship with something God had not commanded them. Leviticus 10:1, not commanded them to do. And we're going to apply contraposition to it. Remember, go back here, we're going to take the antecedent, and we're going to trade places with it and the consequence right here. We're going to swap them, we're going to negate both of them. Everyone got that? And just by way of review, it's easy to get lost in this. Remember, contraposition was used by Jesus and by the apostles, and then it's used in the scriptures, right? So by contraposition, our proposition becomes, I'll highlight it, and I'll just bring it down to there. If an act is something that God has commanded for an act of worship, then the act is not sinful to do for it. Well, that's plain as day. That's axiomatic. That's self-evident. If God commanded it, then it's certainly not sinful to do it. If God commands it, it's going to please God if you do what He says. So we can, by transposition, we can see that we've got it laid out pretty good right here. Right? If He commanded it, it's not sinful. If He didn't command it, yeah. If we reverse it now, go back and read it, what it says. If it's sinful to do for worship, then it's an act that He has not commanded. All right? So we get two different views to view our authority for worship. First, if an act is something God has commanded for an act of worship, then it's not sinful to do it. Well, that ought to be real simple to see. That one's pretty plain. If God commanded it, it's not wrong. It can't be wrong if God commanded it. All right? Second, if an act is sinful to do for worship, then it's something God has not commanded. This tells me something about God's command with regard to worship. He's given us all we need to know for worship. And if we apply induction to it, what He's commanded, we don't add anything to it. Okay? Because it'd be sinful to do it if He hadn't commanded it. If an act is something God has commanded for an act of worship, it's lawful, not sinful to do it. If an act is something to do for worship, if it's sinful, then it's something He had not commanded. Okay. Right? Any questions? Now that's a thought that some people hadn't thought about. We need God's commandment before we need to be doing it in worship. God has given a specific commandment, and we go back to chapter 13 now, of where the fire was to come from, then it would be sinful to obtain it from any other source, right? Unless God has specified an alternative source by another commandment. Now, let me give you a little clue here. If we go in on some occasions, we find an alternative commandment or to substitute for another specific commandment, right? We won't go back and read all of this, but let me point out to you, Numbers 9, 6 through 13. He gave an exception for the partaking of the Passover. And they would do it at a certain time, at a set day of the year, but they could do it at another time if there was an exceptional case. And he gave some exceptions for when they could do it. Okay. Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles 30 appealed to this substitute, and they did it in those days. So we have a substitute. So there was an exception stated. See, God had allowed an exception. Right? Now, any question about that? All right. Now, let's show what I'm claiming probably happened. Now we're using induction. We're back to induction now on this. All right. I think this is the most likely scenario. Aaron, the high priest, was given specific instructions on where to obtain the fire for his censer. Now that's pretty clear. So we're going to read that. And Aaron shall present the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. And back if you go to Hebrews, you see that's one difference between him and Jesus. Jesus didn't have to offer sin for himself, but Aaron did. And shall make atonement for himself and for his house, and shall kill the bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself. He shall take a censer full of coals of fire from off the altar before Jehovah, and his hands full of sweet incense beaten small, and bring it within the veil. He shall put the incense upon the fire before Jehovah, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat, which is upon the testimony that he die not. He's to do this, and he's under threat of death, penalty of death. And he shall take of the blood of the bullock and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat on the east. And toward the mercy seat shall he sprinkle of the blood with his finger 7 times. All right? He is threatened with death if he doesn't do it this way. All right? Now, any question about that? That's right in the text of the Bible. I determine in my judgment, it's plain, it's evident that this is written down later after the events of Leviticus 10. I think they're chronological. This tells me that God had given this instruction beforehand orally to Moses, and through him to Aaron. Anybody think that's wrong? Okay. Remember, specific instruction without an exception being given are exclusive. We derive that from the law of exclusion in chapter 13, which we just came from. This means that the high priest could not get his fire from any place except the altar. That's the only place he'd get it, under penalty of death. This leads to the following argument. It's very likely, but not certain. I'm not being dogmatic about it. Nadab and Abihu did not get their fire for their censers from the altar. We can't prove that they did. But I know if they had not gotten it from the altar, they would have been under penalty of death. And I know they died. I cannot find any written instructions for the fire anywhere else in the scriptures. Now, you say, well, this is just applied to the high priest. Yep. We're going to use the a fortiori principle now to show you that it applied to them too. Implicit evidence now that this applied to them. They were also under penalty of death if they didn't get it from the altar. Okay. If the high priest had specific instructions, first premise, that forbade him to obtain the fire from his censer from anywhere except the altar, then the lesser priests had specific instructions that forbade them from obtaining fire from their censer from anywhere except the altar. A fortiori, what's not true of the greater is not true of the lesser. And high priest had specific instructions that forbade him, said not to do it, see, to obtain the fire from his censer from anywhere except the altar. The high priest was not to obtain, see, that's negative. The lesser priest, Nadab and Abihu, had certain specific instructions that forbade them from obtaining the fire for their censers from anywhere except the altar. I cannot say for certain that that's why they died, but I know that they would have been under penalty of death had they done that, and I know they died. I think the likelihood is very, very strong that this is what happened. But as I say here, we cannot say for certain that this is how Nadab and Abihu sinned. We know it would have been a sin if they had obtained fire from any place except the altar. Anybody disagree with that? Any questions? All right? Now, why did they sin? Commentators have several ideas they come up with as to why they sinned. And it's possible they wanted to draw attention to themselves, like occurred in Leviticus 9, 23, and 24. Right? That's a possibility. Might have an evil motive, okay? And pride could have gotten involved. Second, it's possible they'd been drinking wine or strong drink. This led to their sin. We see this in Leviticus 10, verses 8 through 11. I think they had been doing that. I think that's pretty evident. All right? And they were told not to drink strong drink when they were working in the altar, in the sacrifices. So that might have been why they were killed. So they might have violated this second commandment, not to drink wine or strong drink. Okay, it's possible both of them are true. See, and fourth, there may be other possibilities I haven't considered. But I know this: if they had not gotten it from the altar, the fire, they would have been under penalty of death. Any question? Not necessary for us to know their motives for committing this sin. It is important that we not sin as they did by worshiping in ways that God has not commanded or in other ways. If God hasn't commanded it, we don't have the option to initially say, Lord, you got to accept this as worship because I like it. That's not going to cut it. That won't work. And a bunch of people, that's what they say. Well, I like it. I like this or I like that. So they want to introduce it to tell God that he's going to have to accept that as worship when he's already told us how to worship him. Okay. We see this we do not know the things that both occurred and were written in the scriptures. We know that the things that occurred and were written in the scriptures serve as examples to us. We can get this from 1 Corinthians 10, 6, and 11. Well, from the record of Leviticus 10, 1 and 2, we learn at least two things about worship. First, if an act is sinful to be worshipped, then the act is something God has not commanded. If he hadn't commanded it, it's sinful, see? Or an act of worship, see? From induction, we perceive that God has given us instructions in the scriptures, the universal spiritual information of everything he wants us to do in worship. Okay? Remember that inductive reasoning from the universal information becomes deductive. We saw that in chapter 12. If an act is something God has commanded for an act of worship, then the act is not sinful. If he's commanded, it can't be sinful. God wouldn't command us to sin. So that's pretty axiomatic, pretty self-evident truth. In order to get a good understanding of what happened to Leviticus 10, we need to apply that principle of sound reasoning, both deductive and inductive reasoning. Do you have questions about Nadab and Abihu? All right. Now, we went through this last week. We went through this Venn diagram already last week, so we'll skip it. Let's go down to our next example. I don't think we covered this last time. So our fourth example of law of exclusion coming to bear, the Lord commanded Christians to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to the Lord. Their singing was to the Lord, see. All right. Speaking one to another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing, making melody with your heart to the Lord. So the singing and making melody is to the Lord. The A-type proposition is all music that God has authorized is singing. And so we can say this, all the music he has authorized is singing. We find it here in this passage. We get an I-type proposition from it, just from this verse. When we look at the rest of the New Testament, we don't find any other music being authorized in the worship of the church. And so we draw the conclusion that the only thing that he authorized, all music that he authorized, was singing. We don't have an O-type proposition contradicting this proposition. We don't have an instance of where some other kind of music is authorized or commanded. We don't have an E-type proposition that says he's not to use any singing. So we don't have either one of those. So it's not contrary to it. So we haven't falsified it in any way. So our A-type proposition, all music that God has authorized is singing, becomes only when making it into an only type proposition, which we've been doing in the last week and the last lesson that we had. Only singing is music God has authorized. So the law of exclusion excludes other types of music. Now, this includes ruling out other types of vocal music. It's not just vocal music that he authorized. He only authorized singing. He didn't authorize humming. He didn't authorize whistling and other things like that. See, we talked about that, I believe, last week. Any questions? And now, only singing is music God has authorized. Excludes other types of music. And it includes other types of vocal music even, not just instrumental music. Not just a combination of instrumental and vocal. Now we come to another complex constructed dilemma with the related conclusion. Did I cover this? Somebody help me. I feel like I've already covered it, but I've been studying it so much. Right. For men to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with an instrument at home. Now notice, at home, I went ahead and footnoted it and made it broader, anywhere outside the assembly. All right. And so anywhere outside the assembly intending to worship God, then he sins by worshiping him properly. If he does it intending to worship, then he doesn't, he's not authorized to do it. See? And by the principle of law of exclusion, he's forbidden to do it. See? If he sings psalms and spiritual songs with an instrument at home and does not intend to worship, then he sins by profaning the sacred. Because some psalms and songs are sacred by their very nature; they're holy. We don't use sacred things, holy things for our own pleasure. I believe we got into that in Amos last week. I believe we did get into this already. Okay. All right, so I've already covered this. And either a man sings psalms, hymns, spiritual song with an instrument at home intends to worship or not to worship. All right. So if he doesn't intend to worship, then he is doing it for he's using spiritual things for a profane purpose. And that's profaning the sacred. So he's either profaning the sacred or he's worshiping sinfully or worshiping improperly. All right. Any questions?
The examples you give are when the man is using his voice. If the man is not using his voice, but only an instrument, wouldn't the situation be the same?
If he's using an instrument, he's not authorized. He's only authorized to sing. And the scriptures in forbid any other kind of music.
Right. Okay.
That would include vocal with instrumental accompaniment. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
I was making a different kind of distinction, and I agree. There's a chart I generally do when I talk about this. I put the word sound at the top, and then I branch off from there into other types of sound.
Yeah.
And work it down the path.
Vocal sound, and it was, and so it was an act of singing. I don't believe you're singing when you whistle. Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I think I can whistle pretty good, but I'm not going to do that for worship. Okay. I'm not the greatest at whistling. One of my teachers in high school was real good at whistling. He came up with he entertained us with during some of our meetings in the school by whistling, old Suzanne and stuff like that. And it sounded real good. He did pretty good at it. Okay, but I don't think he can use that for worship. All right, I'm going to move on if it's okay with everybody. Matthew 28:19 and Mark 16:15. We have a general commandment. Now, notice we have a generic commandment, general commandment. And there's no specific details given in the scriptures, and it has to be fulfilled. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Mark 16:15, and he said to them, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. So let's take the commandment to go, and we're looking at this be given to the apostles. Both of them have go, and that's in English, of course. We may have different words in Greek, but that's no big deal. Let's just use our go in English. And they could have gone by ship. They could have walked. They could have gone in any other lawful manner available to them. That's my assertion. They're allowed to go in any manner not prohibited, either explicitly or implicitly by the scriptures. Okay? Now, the apostles would have been implicitly prohibited from stowing away on a ship because that would entail stealing the fare, Ephesians 4:28. Let them that stole steal no more. Saying you can't steal. But let him labor working his hands that which is good, and may have whereof to give to him that hath need. So we know that God did not intend for them to do evil, that good would come. We see this in Romans 3:28. Therefore, we know that the A-type proposition, the apostles were required to go into all the world, must be qualified. The apostles were required to go into all the world in a lawful manner. In other words, they couldn't do something that would be forbidden by God. And I believe God left it to their judgment, although I think the apostles were given miraculous wisdom and they chose the best ways to go. In many instances, not every instance, however. And I believe this is what we have here. He left the judgment of the ones here, and this was the apostles, to determine the best means possible to obey this commandment, as long as their means was lawful. Now, I want you to notice a footnote. In my Great Commission book, I discuss page 129 to 133, evidence that the apostles went. Sometimes were given miraculous guidance as to where to go, and even I think they were even miraculously transported in some instances. I established that in those pages. This is the area in which both the church collectively and Christians individually are allowed to use their judgment. And God wants us to use the best judgment we can, and that's why elders were chosen, and there should be wiser than the normal member of the church by virtue of their qualifications. So that's why they were to make these decisions, okay? I think wise elders will consult the congregation for any suggestions they have, but they have to make the final decision. Sometimes they can get wisdom from other people. And what do you think about it, see? And the elders still have to make the final decision. Generic commandments are fulfilled by lawful means. So we have generic commandments fulfilled by lawful means. We could have a number of other generic commandments, see? They were commanded to assemble on the first day of the week and to break bread, and also to give the means contribution, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. On every first day of the week, in fact, the Greek reads in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. So, but it doesn't tell you what time of day on the first day of the week they're to do it. So they could do it at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or whatever. That makes sense? As long as it's on the first day of the week. Yeah. So we refer to this as the law of inclusion. Generic commandments are fulfilled by lawful means, by inclusive means, and means that include lawful acts, and we refer to that to law of inclusion. Law of exclusion is a specific commandments with no exceptions, and with law of inclusion, we have a generic commandment and no exceptions to it as well. See, so we can't do anything that's forbidden. Okay, so we have to have a commandment forbidding it. See, let me explain why I say these laws are necessary. I believe they're necessary because God is perfect. The nature of Him requires that. And we call this the principle of divine economy or parsimony. God only does what's necessary to be done, always does everything He does in the most efficient manner. He's God. He's not inefficient in any way, shape, form, or fashion. So God wrote the scriptures in the most efficient manner that was possible for them to be written. I have to believe that. The law of exclusion would reduce the number of pages or amount of writing necessary to prohibit something. I'll illustrate that in just a moment. It would require a considerable amount of writing to prohibit every possibility without this law. And I'll give an illustration of it in just a moment. The law of inclusion would reduce the amount of writing necessary to give a positive instruction. It would require a considerable amount of writing to include every possibility without this law. And so the scripture would have to be very much longer if it didn't have these two laws, these two principles. If they weren't true, we wouldn't even be able to understand the scriptures. Illustration, if God intended the scripture to be a pattern for all time, and the scriptures plainly teach He did, and we need to use the law of exclusion and the law of inclusion, both of these laws in order to understand it. And I'm going to use the law of exclusion first to be understandable. If God must specifically list every possibility He wishes to prohibit, He would list things that are unknown to mankind. For example, let's assume God wanted only grape juice to be used in the Lord's Supper. He would have to say, use grape juice, but don't use Coca-Cola, don't use Pepsi-Cola, don't use coffee, don't use tea, and so forth. He'd have to go on and on. See? But once he specified grape juice, the fruit of the vine, then he automatically, in that context, it was grape juice. Keep that in mind, it wasn't watermelon juice. But he said, fruit of the vine, use only grape juice. Then he would have had to list these others. But since we have the law of exclusion, he didn't have to list them. He specified that and didn't give any exceptions to it. Ancient man would not have understood references to Coca-Cola, probably not to coffee and tea either, and some other drinks that we have. So the scripture wouldn't have been understandable to ancient man if he'd have said, you can have grape juice, can't use orange juice, can't use lemon juice, can't use lime juice, can't use tomato juice, can't use. See, they had just list, just page after page of stuff not to have. And the people wouldn't have understood what tomato juice was, because it was, I think, discovered in the New World after about 1492. And the coffee and tea came late, after the first century. Coca-Cola was invented in the 20th century, I believe, in the United States. So there's other drinks, coffee and tea and other things. You just go right on down. And he'd had to list just one page after another of things not to do. Every time he had a commandment, he just had to list all things you can't do. But if we have this law of exclusion, then once he gives a specific commandment and there are no exceptions given to it, automatically that's the only way you can do it. Now, does that make sense? Everyone, is that clear? All right. Now, if he intended to be a pattern for all time, he would need to use the law of inclusion for the scripture to be understandable. So, if God must specifically list every possibility he wishes to allow when he gives a generic commandment, he would list things that are unknown to mankind. For example, if God wanted the apostles to be allowed to transport themselves in any way possible, that was lawful, see, that he didn't forbid, then he would have said, he had to say, go and you can go in on a camel, on a horse, you can go on a llama, you can go on a donkey, you can go on a mule, you can go on a car, you can go on an airplane, you can go on a train. Well, they wouldn't know what cars, trains, and airplanes were back in the first century. See, the Bibles wouldn't have been understandable to them. He had to list a bunch of stuff. He might have had to list stuff we hadn't even thought about at this 21st century, at this very time I'm speaking. There may be other modes of transportation, right, that come up with. So we rightfully reason that since riding on cars, trains, airplanes are neither explicitly nor implicitly forbidden, they're lawful means of going. I go on a dog sled. I get on a dog sled up in the Arctic region, ride on it. See? And so what I'm saying is the Bible would have to be a whole lot longer and just wouldn't be very understandable if we didn't have these two laws, but they're very simple. Now then, any question or comment about that? I think it's just plain old common sense that these laws have to be in the Bible. Not only do they need them to make the Bible shorter and easier to understand, but I don't think you could have understood it. Those people wouldn't have been able to understand. There may be other folks, translation we hadn't even thought about. And I believe it's lawful to get on a dog sled and ride and go to preach the gospel. I think reindeer pull sleds. See? I go on and on with other animals. I get on a camel. I get on a mule or a donkey. I get on a horse. I could get on a llama. They're able to carry you, but they're smaller. I get on some other animal. I go ride on an elephant. See, elephants. I've never been on an elephant, but I could. I'd be half afraid to get on a big old elephant, but anyhow, it'd be lawful to do it, though. It wouldn't be wrong. Now then, let's just use common sense now. People use both the law of exclusion and law of inclusion. They're not things that are hard to understand. In our daily lives, we use them all the time. You go into a restaurant, you look at the menu and see several soft drinks on the menu. The waiter comes by and says, "What would you like to drink?" That's usually what they do in America. They ask you what you want to drink first. And they'll go get your drink, bring it in it, and then you'll look at the menu and you'll pick your order while they're gone. That's typically what waiters and waitresses do. So if you replied, when he said, "What would you like to drink?" you replied, "Just bring me a soft drink," I'd probably surprise the waiter. Why? Well, because he had never had anybody do that before, probably. But you'd be giving him freedom to bring you any soft drink on the menu, see? Because your answer is inclusive. See, bring me a soft drink. Well, that includes anything on the menu that's classified as soft drink. Yeah, but it wouldn't be allowed to bring you a beer or some other drink that's hard liquor or liquor, because that's not classified as a soft drink in the United States. Okay. So your answer is inclusive. If you said, "I want a Coca-Cola," he would not be doing what you said if he brought any other drink, because your answer is exclusive. You excluded everything else. You intended that be the only thing you be brought. And I'm amazed that people do not see the simplicity and wisdom of this principle, the law of exclusion and law of inclusion, when it comes to spiritual matters. Any questions? They seem to become irrational when it comes to spiritual matters. I don't understand why they would. Are there questions? Anybody? All right. The necessary inferences. I think we can probably cover one, maybe. We got about 15 minutes and we'll be through. The scriptures, we look at necessary inference part 1. The scriptures teach in two different ways: by explicit statements, explicitly, and by implicit statements, and by implication, by logical. We have to draw a conclusion, necessary inference. I want to use Genesis 12 through 13 as the basis of two necessary inferences in this section. We'll probably just get one of them used here before we close. I'm going to go to Genesis 12:5. And there's a man named Abram. His name was later changed to Abraham, and he had a wife named Sarai, and her name was later changed to Sarah. So I'm just going to probably just call it Abraham and Sarah, but we'll be reading Abram and Sarai. And Abram and Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son. So that's Abraham's nephew, Abram's nephew. And all their substance that they had gathered and the souls they had gotten in Haran. That means their servants that they'd gotten. And they went forth to go to the land of Canaan, and the land of Canaan they came. So they went forth into the land of Canaan. Now, when we read this, it doesn't explicitly tell us that they all went together. Right? It states they went into Canaan. Abram, Sarai, and Lot went from Haran, which is now in probably what we would know as, I think it was probably being the nation of Syria at this time. Okay, but it's in that region on the Euphrates River. But the passage explicitly states that Abram and Abraham in Genesis 7:15, his name changed to Abraham, and Sarah, and that's in Genesis 7:15, 7:5, Abram's name changed to Abram. In chapter 17, verse 15, Sarah's name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. And Lot went from Haran to land of Canaan. It says that they all went. But it doesn't explicitly say they went together. But I believe it's reasonable that they did go together, and I'll give you 5 reasons for it. Now, I'm using induction now. But you see, this is not a critical matter that we know that they went together. But I think that's pretty evident they probably did. Although it's not a fellowship issue, and it's certainly not an issue of our salvation. Okay? I think it's reasonable. I'm going to give you my 5 reasons why I think they traveled together, and I think it's pretty evident. Women didn't travel alone at that time, so Sarai or Sarah probably traveled with Abram, with her husband. That makes perfectly good sense. Okay, they were all family, and we conclude it's almost certain that they went together. All 3 of them went together with their people. So, being family members, that they would do that probably. Traveling into a strange land, either alone or in smaller groups, is more dangerous than traveling in a larger group for protection. See, so that's a good reason to have gone together. If they'd gone in 2 separate groups, there'd be some difficulty in the second group locating the first group after they arrived in Canaan. They had to hunt around, try to find them. Okay. If they remained together, they had fellowship of both groups to encourage each other to reduce loneliness, provide aid if problems arose, something come up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons here. And there may be other reasons, but it looks to me like we got some pretty good inductive reasons why they probably went as a group. Although it's not important to us, it's not critical for our salvation or for any other points we're going to make, that we know that they went together, but they probably did. So by induction, we say and there's no negative information, no good reason why they would have traveled separately. I conclude Abram, Sarai, and Lot probably traveled together from Haran to Canaan. But what's important for us is to know that they all left Haran and we all went up Canaan together. And whether they went together or not, which probably they did, but we say from induction, we say if points A, B, C, and D, and E are true, there's no good reason to travel in 2 separate groups, and Abram and Lot and Sarai probably traveled as one group. And so these points are true, and there's not any good reason that I can see to travel in 2 separate groups. So they probably traveled as one group. Now that's probably what happened. Any questions? All right. So now we've used induction. Now we're going to use deduction in this next one here, and we'll go through it. Let me see here. You know, I think we better stop here with this. All right. Let's start here with due to a famine in Genesis 12:10 for next week. Are there questions? We'll start here on this verse. Any questions?